The air inside the Santa Monica gym in mid-July of 1972 didn't just sit in the room. It hung there like a wet wool blanket. It was a thick, oppressive mixture of stale chalk, old sweat, and the kind of high testosterone ego that defined the West Coast lifting scene of the early 70s. This wasn't a modern fitness center with air conditioning and rows of elliptical machines. This was a dungeon of iron, a place where men came to move heavy things and prove they were the apex predators of the boardwalk. In the center of this sweltering arena stood a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His name was Miller, a 265-pound bodybuilder whose chest was so broad it seemed to cast its own shadow. He was a mountain of a man, a local legend who lived for the clank of the squat rack and the silent awe of the crowds. Right now, however, Miller wasn't being silent. He was laughing. It was a deep, guttural sound that echoed off the brick walls, fueled by a mixture of amusement and genuine disbelief. He was looking down from his 6'2" vantage point at a man who stood barely 5'7" and weighed almost half as much as he did. The smaller man was Bruce Lee. To the world, he was becoming a cinematic icon, the whirlwind of motion in the Green Hornet, and the star of a rising wave of martial arts films. But to the lifters in this gym, he was just a movie star playing dress-up. He was a karate man in a world of giants, and Miller decided it was time to put the fantasy to rest. Miller threw down a challenge that felt more like a public execution of a reputation. He gave Bruce exactly 60 seconds. 60 seconds to prove that all the talk of internal power and mechanical efficiency wasn't just Hollywood smoke and mirrors. The deal was simple, brutal, and final. If Bruce could make Miller move, just move his feet from their planted position, within those 60 seconds Miller would admit there was something to this martial arts business. If Bruce couldn't, he was to walk out of that gym and never come back. He was to stop pretending he belonged in a room where real strength was measured in hundreds of pounds of cold steel. The gym went quiet. The heavy rhythm of the weight plates stopped. Men with arms the size of Bruce's thighs stepped away from their benches, wiping grease and grime from their foreheads to watch the slaughter. They had seen Bruce around. They had seen him doing his strange, fluid movements in the corner, but they didn't respect it. They respected mass. They respected the grind. To them, Bruce was a lightweight intruder in a heavyweight sanctuary. Bruce didn't look intimidated. He didn't even look particularly interested. He stood there with his hands hanging loosely at his sides, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look almost fragile compared to Miller's braced, hyper-tense posture. In fact, he looked exhausted. It was a look of total, unadulterated laziness. He didn't drop into a fighting stance. He didn't clench his fists. He didn't even bounce on the balls of his feet. He simply told Miller to brace himself. He told him to put every single ounce of that 120-kilogram frame into his stance. He wanted the mountain to be as unmovable as possible. But there was a catch that made the lifters chuckle. Bruce told them he wasn't going to strike Miller. No punches, no kicks, no cinematic flourishes. He told them he was just going to breathe. The clock on the wall, a heavy industrial piece with a red second hand, began its slow, methodical sweep. The only other sound in the room was the distant, rhythmic hum of a floor fan that was doing nothing more than pushing the hot air around. Miller dug his heels into the rubber mats. He leaned forward slightly, his center of gravity low and wide, his massive quadriceps bulging as he locked his knees. He looked like a statue anchored into the very foundation of the building. He started mocking Bruce, shouting for him to do something, to stop wasting everyone's time. He called him a dancer. He called him a fraud. 30 seconds passed. Bruce remained perfectly still. His eyes were closed. His chest wasn't heaving. In fact, it barely seemed to move at all. He looked like he was falling asleep on his feet. The tension in the room, however, was doing the opposite. It was ratcheting up with every tick of the clock. The mockery from the crowd began to die down, replaced by a strange, uncomfortable curiosity. Why wasn't he moving? Was he really going to just stand there and let the clock run out? It's easy to mistake relaxation for weakness. In a world that prizes the hustle, the grind, and the outward display of effort, we often think that if we aren't straining, we aren't working. We think that power comes from tension. We've been taught that to overcome a massive problem, we need to be more massive ourselves. We need to push harder, scream louder, and clench our teeth until they crack. But Bruce was demonstrating something that the men in that gym couldn't comprehend. He wasn't avoiding the struggle. He was removing himself from it. With 20 seconds left, Bruce took a long, slow, lazy inhale. It wasn't a sharp gasp for air. It was a deep, expansive breath that seemed to fill not just his lungs, but his entire torso, from his hips to his collarbones. His ribs expanded like an accordion, but his shoulders stayed down. He looked like a predator that had finally caught the scent. Then, in the final 15 seconds, the lazy man moved. He didn't wind up. He didn't pull his arm back for a shove. He simply stepped into Miller's personal space, a distance so short it seemed impossible to generate any force. He placed his hand against the center of Miller's chest, barely touching the fabric of his shirt. It looked like a gentle tap, the kind of gesture you'd use to get someone's attention in a crowded room. But as Bruce exhaled, something shifted in the atmosphere. It wasn't just a breath, it was an explosion of structural alignment. The lazy relaxation that had defined him for the last 45 seconds suddenly transformed into a conduit for a force that seemed to come from the floor itself. Miller's eyes bulged. The mocking smile he had worn since Bruce walked in vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure, primal shock. His massive legs, the ones that could squat 500 pounds without breaking a sweat, simply gave out. It wasn't that he was pushed backward. It was as if the ground beneath him had turned to liquid. The mechanical force, delivered with the precision of a piston and the silence of a whisper, short-circuited his entire nervous system. The sound was what everyone remembered later. It wasn't the sound of a hit. It was a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of 265 pounds of prime muscle hitting the rubber mats with the grace of a felled oak. Miller didn't stumble. He collapsed. He sat there, gasping for air that he couldn't quite catch, his hands splayed out behind him to keep from falling further. The gym was frozen. Not a single person moved. The man who had been laughing seconds ago was now staring up at the man he had called a fraud. And for the first time in that room, the karate man was the tallest person there. Bruce didn't celebrate. He didn't look at the clock to confirm his victory. He stood there as calm and lazy as he had been at the start, waiting for the dust to settle. He had just shown them that the mountain could indeed fall, not because of a greater weight, but because of a superior rhythm. The question wasn't how much Bruce could lift. The question was, how much of Miller's own weight had Bruce just turned against him? The silence that follows a sudden collapse is different from any other kind of quiet. It's not the silence of a library or a church. It's the silence of a vacuum where the air has been sucked out of the room by pure, unadulterated shock. On the floor of that Santa Monica gym, Miller, a man who lived his life as an immovable object, was struggling to remember how to breathe. His nervous system was a chaotic mess of misfiring signals. His brain was screaming at his legs to stand up, but his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. He wasn't in pain, not in the traditional sense. He felt hollow, as if the very core of his strength had been neatly removed by a surgeon's scalpel. Around the room, the other lifters were still holding their breath. A man halfway through a bench press set sat up slowly, the barbell forgotten. The owner of the gym, a man who had seen every tough guy from San Pedro to Malibu, just stared at the clock. 60 seconds. The challenge was over. The movie star was still standing. The giant was on the floor. But then the atmosphere shifted again. In most stories of this kind, the victor would walk away. He would offer a sharp remark, a triumphant smirk, or perhaps just turn his back on the fallen opponent to let the humiliation sink in. That is what the crowd expected. That is what Miller expected. He braced himself for the verbal sting that usually follows a physical defeat. He expected Bruce to look down at him and mock the 265 pounds of useless muscle. Instead, Bruce Lee did something that confused everyone even more than the strike itself. He didn't move away. He didn't cross his arms. He reached down. He extended a hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, and waited. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of invitation. He waited until Miller's eyes met his, and in that gaze there was no malice, no "I told you so." There was only a calm, steady presence. Miller took the hand. Bruce didn't just help him up, he braced him, making sure the bigger man had his balance before letting go. The lazy man who had just dismantled a mountain was now acting as its support. "You are very strong," Bruce said, his voice quiet but carrying through the still room. "But you are trying to hold the ocean back with a wooden dam. The harder the water hits, the more you break. You must learn to be the water." The mockery that had permeated the gym an hour ago was gone, replaced by a desperate, hungry curiosity. These were men who spent their lives trying to master their bodies, yet they had just seen a level of mastery they didn't know existed. They realized that for all their heavy lifting and iron-willed discipline, they were missing a piece of the puzzle. They were all tension and no flow. For the next hour, the Santa Monica gym stopped being a place of ego and became a laboratory. Bruce didn't leave to catch a flight or head to a film set. He stayed. He pulled Miller and a few of the other giants into a circle. He didn't teach them how to fight. He taught them how to exist within their own skin. He spoke about the lazy breath, the diaphragmatic inhale that doesn't trigger the fight-or-flight response. He explained that when you tense your muscles before the impact, you are actually trapping your own power inside your body. You are fighting yourself before you ever touch your opponent. "Look at the fan," Bruce told them, pointing to the old rattling floor unit in the corner. "It doesn't struggle to move the air. It just turns. It is relaxed, and because it is relaxed, it is fast. Because it is fast, it is powerful. If you tried to make that fan move by pushing it with your own hands, you would only slow it down." He had Miller stand up again. This time, he didn't ask him to brace. He asked him to exhale. He taught him how to drop his weight into his heels without locking his knees. He showed him that true power doesn't come from the bicep or the chest, but from the connection between the breath and the floor. The men who had spent years chasing mass were suddenly fascinated by the invisible. They were learning that the 60 seconds that changed the gym weren't about a trick or a secret move. They were about the removal of resistance. As the sun began to dip toward the Pacific, casting long orange shadows through the high windows of the gym, the session finally wound down. The smell of chalk and sweat was still there, but the high testosterone ego had evaporated. There was a new kind of respect in the room, one that didn't require a loud voice or a heavy lift to prove. Miller, the man who had started the day with a laugh and a challenge, walked Bruce to the door. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a man who had just been given a map to a place he didn't know he could go. Decades later, the men who were in that room on that hot July afternoon still tell the story. They don't talk about it as a fight. They talk about it as a falling. They describe the day the mountain fell and how the man who knocked it down was the same one who helped it back up. It became a piece of gym lore, a reminder that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful, and that the most lazy-looking person might be the most prepared. But the real legacy of that day wasn't in the physical collapse. It was in the change of rhythm. Those lifters started incorporating breathing into their sets. They started looking for the quiet in the middle of the heavy iron. They learned that you don't have to break your own spirit to build your body. It makes you look at your own life, doesn't it? We spend so much of our time bracing ourselves. We brace for the bad news. We brace for the difficult conversation. We brace for the struggle of the workday. We walk through the world with our shoulders up to our ears, thinking that this tension is our armor. We think that if we aren't on guard, we are vulnerable. We mistake our own stiffness for strength. But what if your greatest power is actually hidden in the moments when you let go? What if the 60 seconds you are currently facing in your own life doesn't require more muscle but more breath? Where in your life are you trying to move a mountain by pushing against it, instead of finding the rhythm that makes it move itself? Who have you subestimated in your office, in your family, or on the street simply because they didn't scream their presence? When you finally find yourself in a position of power, when you finally win your next battle, what kind of person will you be? Will you use that moment to stand over someone and watch them gasp for air, or will you be the one to reach down and pull them back to their feet? In the end, Bruce Lee didn't just win a challenge in a Santa Monica gym. He redefined what it meant to be strong. He proved that the ultimate mastery isn't about how much you can crush. It's about how much you can control, starting with the very air in your lungs. Who are you subestimating today? And more importantly, are you brave enough to be lazy when the world expects you to fight? When you finally win, will you destroy or will you teach? Because the man who can do both is the only one who truly never loses.